All right, thanks, Shannon. So hello, everyone. My name is Alex Chan. I am the mental health specialist with University of Maryland Extension. And I'm going to be talking with you all today about internalized stigma and how it is a barrier to getting help. And so we're going to learn some strategies today in our short time together, not only to recognize internalized stigma in ourselves, but also notice when other people are stigmatizing themselves, which is a barrier to getting help. A lot of times these days, people are increasing their comfort with discussing mental health out in the open, and that's great. But that doesn't always translate into personal action to seek assistance. So, sometimes the conversation about mental health leads people just to try self-help strategies, which are very effective, can be very effective. But other times, self-help isn't enough. And so we need to be able to get over that internalized stigma about receiving help so that we can get the help we need and so that our loved ones can get the help that they need. So, I am sorry about that. There's a car alarm going off. All right. So let's get moving. So I show you this continuum of stress here to show that, a lot of times when people are making decisions about when to get help, they think, oh, well, I only need help if it's like really severe. Like it's only if, I am totally depressed, can't handle anything and going through flashbacks, whatever, of PTSD, and that's just not the case. Professional help may be useful much earlier than you might think. And even with mild distress can be helpful to just get a checkup and make sure that you're handling things in the most adaptive way. So that's part of reducing the stigma around receiving help, because people equate help with quote unquote crazy, which we shouldn't be labeling people as. But really, self-help can be, professional help can be very useful, even for mild distress. I'm also a therapist in addition to working for the University of Maryland, and it's much easier when I get a client who has just started experiencing some symptoms. The treatment is much easier. So, both for the therapist, but more importantly for the client, for the consumer, your path to recovery is much quicker when you catch things earlier. And that will, of course, involve breaking through some of those internal barriers to accepting help. So the first step is recognizing that professional assistance is not only for severe cases of mental health problems. It's actually quite useful earlier than that. But of course, there's all kinds of reasons why people might not talk to a professional. And I'm curious, you all can put your thoughts in the chat about why wouldn't you talk to a professional even if you had the time and the money? Why not? Maybe you would feel embarrassed. Maybe you might feel that, you wouldn't want somebody in your family to know, or other people in your social network. And there's all kinds of reasons why people might not talk to a professional, even if they had one sitting right in front of them. I'm open to hearing your guys' thoughts. If you have anything, you can put it in the chat about why you wouldn't talk to a professional. There may be trust issues too. Certain communities, certain individuals may have had bad experiences with mental health providers, and therefore they might be less open to seeking that assistance. And so that's less about that's less about stigma and more about trust. But it's still important to keep all these factors in mind while thinking about talking to, especially if you're thinking about talking to somebody else about them getting help. So you'll want to identify what are the reasons why you might not want to get help, and see, are any of these related to stigma? If it's embarrassment, if it's shame, it's likely that there may be some internalized stigma that you're dealing with. So I keep using this word, and I've attached the word internalized stigma. And the way I like to think about this is that, you get, let's say that you live downwind from a smoke stack, some kind of factory or something with a big smokestack, and you might be the most staunch environmentalist. You don't agree with the amount of pollution that they're putting out. You don't like what they are doing. But if you live downwind from that, you are going to breathe in that pollution, whether you like it or not. And mental illness is the same way. The way we talk about mental illness is the same way. So you may not agree with the way that other people talk about mental health. You might, some of the examples on your screen here, a lot of people view taking help as weak or dependent. You might not agree with that. But because the messages are around us all the time, you can't help but breathe some of that in. So that's why I use, excuse me, that's why I use this smokestack analogy, because you just can't, you can't help but breathe it in. And therefore, you can't blame yourself for having some of these feelings, but you can change the way that you deal with it. So just like pollution, stigma does exist all around us, and it actually functions sort of like a thermostat. It dictates the behavior that we feel comfortable with. So, when we feel like, oh, I know somebody is struggling, or I know I'm struggling and I'm thinking about calling up a therapist, and then you feel reluctance, that's internalized stigma. That's your own shame interfering with the ability to reach out for assistance. And you could even extend this beyond mental health. You could even talk here about any kind of assistance. Maybe at your job, you're working on a big project and you really need some help, but you don't want to show any form of dependency or weakness. That may not really be the optimal way to get the job done, but because you're worried about being viewed in a certain way, or maybe because you agree that, oh yeah, if I did that, I would be weak, then you change your behavior. So just like a thermostat, your thoughts or your potential behaviors are outside of the set point, and therefore you feel compelled to go back to the set point. So, we let this internal thermostat have so much power, usually because we want to maintain a sense of community inclusion. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times individuals with mental illness tend to be excluded. People, avoid them, especially for severe cases. Like, people think that they're going to be hostile or dangerous in some way, which is just not true the majority of the time. And so, but we have, even in the media these days, you see all this stuff linking mental health to like the shootings, and the crime statistics show us that only 4% of violent crime in the United States is conducted by somebody with diagnosed mental illness. Now, clearly, of course, that may be an underrepresentation, and there's clearly something happening if somebody, is committing violent crimes. But it's really, yeah, it's the statistics show us that there's actually an over dependence on writing it off as like that person was mentally ill. Most of the time, mentally ill people are more likely to be the victims of violence. So this is all part of stigma. We all carry around these ideas unexamined. Sometimes if we examine them, we might not even determine like, oh, actually, I don't agree with that. But ultimately, it happens because we all want to remain connected to society, because we depend on that for our foundation. So to sum this up, you can't blame yourself for having breathed in some of the stigma over the years. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you part of the problem, but there are ways to handle it. So part of handling internalized stigma is first to recognize what is even happening and to actually name it as a hazard. And that's different from the way stigma is talked about a lot of the time. Stigma is actually dangerous. So if you look at this little graphic, the person there, he's carrying around problems and probably whatever else is going on, he's got, problems on top of problems on top of problems that are impacting his mental health. And then if you add stigma to that, like, oh, I should be able to take care of this on my own. I shouldn't be able to ask for help. Like, that's not right. That's just more weight. That's not helpful. And it's actually dangerous because it delays this guy's ability to get the help that he needs. So what stigma does, the reason why it is a hazard to health and not just a issue of political correctness or being rude or whatnot, it's a health hazard because it blocks people from solving problems. People add more weight by judging themselves, and over time, if people feel that they can only rely on their own resources, they might turn to problem behaviors, like drinking and even leading on to really intense things like suicide. So ultimately, it is not just an issue of being PC, it is a health hazard. And we need to view it that way if we're going to do something about it. Because it's a lot easier for you to take action on yourself when you view something as a hazard to your health versus when you just view it as, oh, this is the way people nowadays talk about stuff. So these are some of those statements that may be bouncing around inside any one of our brains. A really common one would be, that first one, like, no way am I one of them. Like, I'm not crazy. Like that people, a lot of people equate seeing a therapist with having severe mental illness. That's not the only time when therapy is needed. It's not the only time when it's most beneficial either. The most beneficial time is early in the development of a mental health problem. So really looking out for thoughts like this is going to be helpful in recognizing internalized stigma. You might also recognize if you have like an embarrassment or shame reaction to thinking about asking for help. That's stigma too. That's the stigma that's already been internalized to a rule. It's already been incorporated into your thermostat. So it's already having that effect. And you can realize, all right, this is stigma. This is me having breathed in certain ideals just by growing up in this culture. So what do you do about it? There are 3 ways that I'm going to talk about dealing with this issue of internalized stigma. First is seemingly very simple, although it can be harder to implement than you think. But the idea is simple. You decide what you think. So as soon as you recognize, as soon as you catch yourself thinking that things that you have absorbed without really analyzing them, then you can decide, is it accurate? You can check it. So first you catch yourself, like, oh, I'm thinking something that, not sure about here. I've never really considered how useful this thought is. So then you check on it and say, is this really helping me? Do I want to allow this in my thinking? So even though thoughts may occur without you wanting them there, you can change the thought into something else if you catch it first. So for example, like, oh, once you go to therapy, they're just going to force you to take medication. You're going to be labeled as crazy, this and that, blah, blah, blah. You might catch that thought and say, actually, is that accurate? And what you may find is, if you do the research, that it's not accurate. Therapy is not a lifelong thing. It doesn't have to be. They definitely can't force you to take medication. There's all kinds of different treatment methods, and very few therapists are all about labeling you as somebody with a mental illness. Diagnosis is really just a tool for clinicians to talk with each other and to give the consumer some idea of what they're dealing with. But the labels too don't have to be long-term. Recovery is possible. So really, that's just one example of an internal, a stigmatizing thought that might prevent you from seeking help. It's like, if I seek help, that means I'm going to be labeled. I'm going to be, they're going to pump me full of drugs, and it's going to be this lifelong thing. And that prevents you from getting help that otherwise would make the situation better and probably avoid the need for things like longer term therapy or medication. So that's just one example of the 3 C's: catching it, checking if that's accurate, and then changing it. And it requires practice because we have internalized a lot of stigmatizing thoughts about mental health. Now, next is really getting at that labeling thing. A lot of times, people don't want to go to a therapist or accept professional help or even talk with their friends about mental health because they don't want to be labeled as someone with mental illness. That's okay. And really, we have to expand our definition of who we are. You know, like, look at that second example on the screen there, addict. You know, we shouldn't be labeling people that way anyway, you know, because that's not the only way that that person is defined. You know, so rather than calling somebody an addict, you might recognize, or yourself an addict, you might recognize, well, what else is part of my life? I also work at a store, and I'm a parent at 3, and I've actually been 2 years sober, and I've got a strong practical streak. You know, there's so many facets to your identity besides being an addict, you know, or a person who uses drugs, you know, is a better way of saying that. And, you know, that's the same is true for whatever label you're struggling with. So examine the labels that you apply to yourself, especially as they relate to problems, and try to put the person first. Like, you are a person who is multifaceted and does a lot of different things in addition to dealing with whatever mental health challenge you're facing. So your problems don't define you. And the way to remind yourself of that is that, you know, first you say, like, all right, recovery is possible. My problems are important, but they don't define me or what my future will be. Now, the next point of, you know, releasing that label is self-compassion. You know, that, you know, even if you already have a diagnosis or you already know that you're challenged with something, you don't, like, the path to recovery, even though most people can recover from mental illness, like, it's not often easy. So if you're not making the progress that you want to make, that doesn't mean you have to settle into a label of I'm messed up or I'm broken. The path forward is not often super easy. So you need to be compassionate towards yourself and treat yourself as a friend would. Keep going. Like, the path is uneven. You might not get there in one fell swoop. You know, just the first round of therapy may not do it. You may also have to combine medication and other support groups and whatever else. So be compassionate and realize that, you know, the path may be uneven. Finally, to really emphasize that you're multifaceted, your whole life doesn't have to be focused on getting better. Like, getting better, recovery, seeing a therapist, doing what you need to do, your homework is part of it. But you may also want to think about, what are the things that bring me joy? You know, what are the ways that I can grow my strengths? You know, do I have hobbies, you know, that I want to engage in? Or are there areas of weakness that I really would enjoy, you know, beefing up, to prove to myself, you know, or really remind myself that I am multifaceted. So 3 little tips there on preventing. The technical term for this is identity engulfment. Like, your identity is engulfed by a problem, you know? So, and that when that happens, people are less likely to seek help because they think, oh, this is just an unchanging aspect of me. So rather than that, you remind yourself, I'm multifaceted and my problems aren't forever. And that actually increases the likelihood of getting help, because you can say, all right, it won't be forever. I should try to get help because that will help it be even more temporary. Finally, the last strategy I want to talk about in addressing internalized stigma is helping others. And that may sound like, you know, an oxymoron, because you're thinking, wait, I'm dealing with my own stigma by helping somebody else. But the reason it helps is because when you interrupt somebody else's stigmatizing statements about themselves, or just stigma in general, you are in effect calling up that side of your brain that remembers all this information and rehearsing it, which increases your own belief. So as your belief increases, it becomes easier to apply those things to yourselves. I actually have personal experience with this, where after giving this presentation several times, you know, and I knew at the time, you know, especially when I started giving this presentation a while back, that I was like, you know, I could probably use, you know, a therapist appointment, but I didn't do it. for a long, long time. And then I started giving this presentation. I was like, I should do it. So the effect of interrupting somebody else's stigmatizing thoughts can actually help you with your own thoughts too. So what does this look like? This is a really generic example, but it is evidence of stigma, right? If you're saying to somebody, hey, you seem less energetic, what's going on? Are you okay? It's a very common response for somebody to say, oh, it's nothing. I just need to power through it. Like they may even tell you, the story may be longer than that. They may even tell you like, oh, hey, like, yeah, I've got all this stuff going on, this and that, finances and family problems, blah, 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 but I think I just need to power through it. That's internalized stigma, because that is showing that they've breathed in this thought that you just have to take care of yourself. You're showing weakness if you ask for help. So since that is not true, and that actually asking for help helps you get better faster, you would interrupt that. So you might say, oh yeah, like let's say you're talking to a coworker, like, I know you're a hard worker. So you give them a little bit of acknowledgement and praise there. Like, I know you're a hard worker, but burning the candle at both ends really takes a toll on your health, so have you considered that there's all these options out there? You don't tell them what to do, but you just give them the information about, there's people out there that can help. And treatment often makes issues much more manageable so that you don't have to just power through it. So the interruption does not have to be rude. The interruption can be very sensitive, but you're bringing in the knowledge of like, oh, what am I hearing here? Am I hearing that this person has inaccurate information? Am I hearing that this person has engulfed their identity, like they're just defining themselves by their problems? Can I interrupt any one of those things and say, no, you're not just a bad parent or whatever, like, you don't, that's not you, like, you've got all this other stuff going on, and if you want to work on that, there's people out there that can help you. So that is so simple, takes you 10 seconds to say, and you might really be setting somebody on the right path there, in addition to rehearsing the thought yourself. Because when you say it, it helps you believe it more too. So 2 birds with 1 stone there. So one thing that I like to do to kind of highlight the impact of internalized stigma is the Lasagna Test. And sorry, it's lunchtime, probably making people more hungry, but the Lasagna Test is, basically a story where you compare your reactions. So imagine that a friend of yours got in a car accident, they broke their leg or something, and they were in bed for like a month. You might think to bring them a lasagna, just to show goodwill and say, hey, hope you get better soon. So you bring that attitude of like, I'm going to be a helper here. I'm going to bring you something to help you out. I'm also going to wish you, that you get better soon, because that's all part of how we view a lot of medical conditions, especially something like breaking a leg. So then change the scenario though. Imagine if that same friend or coworker or whoever was in bed, because of a mental health issue, like they were struggling with severe depression. Would you think to bring over the lasagna then? And if you feel any reluctance, then that's showing that, there is some stigma that you've internalized. That they're still in need of support, they're still in need of well wishes, but we often hold back because we think that it's not appropriate for some reason. So the purpose of this is not to like shame your reaction around the Lasagna Test. It's just to show that we don't often have the reaction that we want to have. Oops, sorry, there's children around. We don't often have the reaction that we want to have, despite our best efforts. So sure, okay, so I'm actually gonna have to uproot myself temporarily because I'm outside. So I'm sorry everyone for this disruption. I am not in the location that I planned to be for this, but if you are going to offer somebody help, then you have to know who will be able to help. So there's several people out there. There are, of course, doctors, psychologists, social workers, and a variety of master's level people. If a quick note on psychiatrists versus psychologists. So psychiatrists are the ones that prescribe medication. Psychologists do testing and evaluation. So they don't prescribe medication. But you can see there's a whole variety of people out there who can help, as well as a whole variety of treatments that can help here. So I'm viewing that my time here is short with this setting. I'm sorry for the ruckus here, but that is my content about stigma. And I want to know if there's any questions from the audience about battling the stigma, or how to respond to your own reluctance or the reluctance of other people. I'd love to answer any questions right now. And here's some resources on the screen that you may want to explore. But are there any questions about any of the materials that I've presented so far? Please feel.
Thank you so much, Alex. And it sounds like school let out. So I know he's off-site doing a program. Any questions? I think this is one thing that we've definitely been talking about within their agricultural space, but then even more broadly with some of the things that people are going through. I think that raising this awareness and having these conversations, and how to talk and communicate with people around this subject is extremely important.
Yes, and I'm glad that I had the chance to present. Sorry for the bit of child-induced chaos at the end. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, thanks for the opportunity here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alex. And I'm going to stop the recording